to this and that. 12 August, Lecture 10 on Shaikh Capitalism competition.
to get now into two different aspects. One is a historical aspect of the classical theory of price, reminding you of the structure of the argument in Ricardo and Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And then I want to use that as a foundation to talk about the meaning of the empirical evidence that I laid out before, and particularly its relation to some very startling new arguments related to the empirical evidence actually that I've been developing for a long time. And we're going to end up with a discussion of the possibility that Marx's transformation, which has long been attacked as being incomplete, may turn out to be in fact complete for reasons which are quite surprising and very, very recent mathematical arguments. So let me just remind you of the classical origins of the theory of relative price. Adam Smith begins deliberately telling the story of relative prices by breaking competition down into two parts. Competition among producers and then among capitals. And so in the first instance, he develops what he calls the rude and early state, which is an analytical argument that says, let us consider a situation in which we have commodity production and we have the mobility of producers from one sector to another in search of the highest income. Now notice that here the producers are the owners of the means of production, and the income they get comes from selling their product. So then he makes the following argument, which is in fact easily established analytically, which is that if you had a system in which you had private production for sale, but the owners, the producers got all the income, then the income would depend on the price. But if there was competition in the sense that there was mobility of producers on one sector or another, then a sector that had a higher income per hour of labor versus a lower income per hour of labor, people would go from the lower to the higher more preferentially, and this would increase the supply relatively here, decrease it where the income is lower. So this would lower the price by increasing the supply, so the income would come down, in the opposite case income would come up, and you would end up with a situation, turbulent perhaps, in which incomes would be equalized. Now that notion, which is easily shown analytically, implies that if incomes per hour are equal through the price, then the price has to be proportional to the direct and indirect labor time. Okay, that's easily shown, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute anyway. So what you end up with is Adam Smith's starting point, which is prices proportional to labor time, which he calls a rude and early state. But as Marx points out, it's really an analytical step because it allows us then to ask the question, what are the factors that cause prices to deviate from this proportionality? In Marx's terms, what causes prices to deviate from labor values? Right away, Smith says, consider the situation which I just set up, in which the producers get all of their, the price, and therefore their income is basically the price minus their costs, their value added. And if they are the only factor then in the story, then value added per worker will be equalized, and that's equal to the income per worker, and therefore price is proportional to labor time. Now Smith says, okay, but now suppose I divide that value added up in that a portion goes to capital and a portion goes to landlord. So now he's introduced private property in the means of production and class, just one step. Everybody understand that? And in that step, he also says it's obvious that this division of the value added does not in itself imply any reason for prices to deviate from labor values, from direct and indirect labor time. As long as the division keeps the total value added the same, in other words, as every class gets a fraction of the value added, which is the same across sectors, then you will get prices proportional to labor time. So imagine that we start off with a situation in which one set of producers here, another set there, and this set is getting $12 an hour of labor time. In other words, value added per hour of $12, and this one is getting 10, right? So then we say that more people are going to enter here and bring the value added per worker down to 11, and because people are leaving, the lower one, value added per worker, goes up to 11, right? So roughly, you get $11 per hour of value added, but they're only private producers, so that's also the income per hour in each sector, because the mobility of the producers is equalize the income per hour, okay? Now, Smith says, okay, but this 11 here, suppose I introduce analytically now class relations. So now the producers become workers. They weren't before, they were private producers, but now analytically they're workers. So they get 5. The other 6 goes to land and capital. So 4 to capital, 2 to rent. It adds up to 11. Same over here. The proportions are the same. So now we've established that the division of value added into profits, rents, and wages does not in itself require any deviation of prices from labor times, right? Because he's already established that you can have that division. So what has he done? He's introduced competition. He's shown he can introduce equalization of wages, and as long as there are equal proportional divisions in the different components, then there's no necessity for prices to change at all. Now, consider one more step. Suppose that ignore for the land because it's the same issue. So let's suppose we divided that 11 into 5 for workers, 6 for capital. And 5 for workers here and 6 for capital there, right? Because the equalization makes value added the same. Now, clearly, if the capital labor ratios were the same, then the 6 for capital would give you the same profit rate here as it would there. So obviously then, even equalization of profit rates is not in itself a reason for prices to deviate from labor values. What is specific is the deviation of capital labor ratios, the difference of capital labor ratios, and that alone is the reason. Not competition, not equalization of profit rates, not class, not equalization of wage rates, but specifically the capital labor differences, or what Marx would call organic compositions of capital differences. Is that point clear? Because I can go over that many times until it does become clear. Yeah.
I have a question. Then, would that imply that if you have different capital labor ratios among industries, that means that each industry distributes value added among the classes in a different way?
Indeed, and how can it do that? It only by prices being different from labor values, right? So it was already known to Smith and Ricardo and Marx that you can explain the existence of class and the functions of competition and the existence of profit, therefore. Because Smith says it's obvious from this analytical perspective that the reason there is a profit and a rent is because the wage of workers is below the value added. And Marx says, aha, that's surplus value. So that understanding is already in Smith. And I'm going to show you that Marx specifically cites, and Ricardo cites Smith also for that understanding. So what does that establish? It establishes that without any deviation of prices from labor values, we can explain profits and rents, the existence of them. We can explain the material basis for class. We can explain that it comes from the fact that the wage has to be below value added. That's the condition, right? That's the clear general condition. And then this does not necessarily contradict equalization of profit rates, because if the capital labor ratios are equal, then that profit of 6 in each sector would be the same profit rate in the two sectors because the capital labor ratios are equal. Okay? Is that point clear? This is easy to show analytically, but I'm going to do it anyway in a minute because we already did it with Adam Smith's decomposition of price into direct and indirect costs and profits, and we already showed this, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Smith then goes on to argue that, in fact, you can break the price of any commodity into its costs and value added, and the value added can be broken into wages and profits, and then the cost can be broken into wages and profits and value added and input costs and so on, and you go back and forth until finally you've got broken down the price of any commodity into two components, direct and indirect unit labor costs and direct and indirect profit per unit output. And I did that before, and what we ended up showing, I can always break the price into two terms, any price whatsoever. Market price, monopoly price is just an analytical decomposition into wages of the ith sector times the direct and indirect labor time of the ith sector, and wages of the jth sector times that. So this first term is relative vertically integrated, what I call integrated unit labor costs. And the second is simply the ratio of profits to this term, which is the profit wage ratio, but vertically integrated. Now this decomposition, if wages are equal, which is what Smith's concern is with prices of production, with natural prices, wages are equalized, then this depends only on two terms. The ratio of direct and indirect labor time, this is Marx's labor value ratio, and the ratio of profits to wages, the division of value added. Okay? Now notice that if the division of value added is the same, then the ratio of profits to wages is the same, and therefore prices are directly proportional to labor time. That's another way of arriving at that same story, right? And then anything that makes the profit wage ratios equal will give you prices proportional to labor time. Conversely, anything that makes them unequal will give you prices different. So then Smith says, well, by showing this, I've established that it's not the presence of capitalist relations, not wage labor versus profit per se, that requires a deviation of relative prices from relative integrated labor time. I've even shown that if, actually Ricardo says, well, even if capital labor ratios are equal, then this is also proportional to give you equal profit rates, sorry. It will give you equal profit rates, so that's consistent with equalization of profit rates also. And we can see from the way the logic of the argument works that the relative prices of production of any two commodities will be dependent only on two things. The relative labor, integrated labor time, relative labor values in the sense of Marx, times this term, which is a kind of disturbance term, deviation term, and that'll depend on, I can take the profit and divide it and treat it as a profit rate times the amount of vertically integrated capital. And the vertically integrated labor is the wage rate times the vertically integrated labor time, vertically integrated wage bill. So the profit wage ratio is just R over W times this ratio of vertically integrated capital per unit labor. And since the profit rates are equalized, they're the same in the top and the bottom. Wages are equalized, same in the top and bottom. And that establishes that the only cause of the deviation, only competitive, of competitive prices, prices of production from labor time is vertically integrated capital labor ratio differences. Okay, we did this last time, but that's a very important point. It's not the direct differences that are vertically integrated. And what vertical integration means is that the ratio that's relevant is not the observed capital labor ratio, but the ratio that is, in fact, a weighted average of all the capital labor ratios of industries that enter into a given industry. So if I say this is the first industry, it's corn. Corn's capital labor ratio is 6. But the vertically integrated capital labor ratio is 6 plus a weighted average of that and that and that and that, all the ones that enter. And so it'll be a different number. It might be 5. If this one here was 3, if I take the weighted average of all the ones that enter here, it might be 4 because it'll bring you towards the mean, but you're taking an average of all the others, right? So you're going to end up with, instead of 6 and 3, you're going to end up with 5 and 4. And you can see right away that that dispersion is smaller. Hence, this term will be less important. In the way that Smith derives the direct and indirect profit, it's simply the profit of the sector we're considering plus the profits of the raw materials of that sector, which come from all the sectors that it uses as inputs, plus the profits of the raw materials, which come from all the sectors used by that bundle and so on. And that's equivalent to saying that when I look at the profit wage ratio, I'm looking not at the direct profit ratio, but the weighted average of all the profit wage ratios of industries that enter directly or indirectly into this production. Now, if it was a basic system, then all of them enter directly or indirectly. So that means that everybody's profit wage ratio is a weighted average of the same set of raw numbers, which is your direct profit wage ratios. But the weights will be different because you have different materials requirements. And that's known as a convex combination. It's a sum of positive numbers that add up to 1. You can show that formally in this kind of thing. And so that everybody will get a number assigned to them, which will be a weighted average of everybody's original numbers. So you have here, if I can count that far, 5, 6, 7, 10 people, right? So there'll be 10 profit wage ratios. So I take the first one here and I replace it by a weighted average of all 10, right? Then I take the second one and I replace it by a weighted average of the same 10 but a different set of weights. So that's the second one. The third one will be again a weighted average of all 10 with a different set of weights depending on your input requirements. And you can see why the dispersion of these ratios is going to be much smaller, and therefore this term will be less relevant. It depends on the input proportions. You can calculate this from the way I broke out the Smithian decomposition. You can see that at each point the weights will depend on the ratio of inputs to outputs in each layer, so to speak. And you can calculate through that. And this is analytically I minus A inverse. I mean, that's basically what you're doing. You're taking the direct profit wage ratio, multiplying it by I minus inverse, A inverse matrix, and then you get the vertically integrated one. And I showed you last time that the dispersion of the vertically integrated one is only 1/3 the coefficient of variation of the direct ones. So already we know that there's an analytical reason why this dispersion is going to be small. And I would argue that that was pretty clear to people like Smith and Ricardo. They didn't formulate it algebraically, but it was clear from observation that you could see that an industry that produces steel, that uses steel, is going to pick up, so to speak, the profit-wage ratio of steel. But steel has iron and has coal as its raw material. So it's going to pick up those too, and you can sort of see why Ricardo would understand, let's say, that this would not be a big factor. And it's that kind of reasoning that leads Ricardo to say, look, the secondary, this distributional factor, is relatively small. And we went through the empirical evidence last time in the US economy, which I have for different years. I only illustrated a little bit of it. And you can see that this term is on the order of 10 or 15% at best, at most. If you take another argument and say, what happens if I raise the wage? Here, I raise this wage. Well, then we know the profit rate is going to go down, and I'm going to talk about that today. So this term, R over W, is going to move, but in the same way in both top and bottom. So the only effect, the elasticity of prices with respect to distribution will depend on the dispersion of these capital labor ratios, again. Now, with this understanding, we come to Ricardo, because Ricardo already knows this. This is in Smith. And so Ricardo says, okay, I want to pick up the question of how big is this factor? And he chooses to do it in a variety of ways. One question he asks is that one thing he makes clear is that these relative prices deviate from relative labor times only according to the capital labor ratios. And though he doesn't use the term vertically integrated, if you look at his numerical example, you can see that it depends not only on the capital labor ratio of the industry, but also on the capital labor ratio of the industry that produces the inputs. Because he gives you a specific example. He says, consider a machine is made by hand. And then consider that the machine is used to make cloth or cotton. And he shows in this example, therefore, that there's a certain deviation, and you can work backwards to that and see that it depends not only on the cloth capital labor ratio, but also on the machine capital labor ratio, because the machine is an input. Okay? So Ricardo's example is very nice because it's simple, it's clean and elegant, and it expresses his understanding that this deviations are not very big. If you look at the numerical example, you see that the relative deviations of prices from labor time are quite small. But then Ricardo asks a different question. He says, well, okay, I've given you an example where this deviation is not very big, but I want to ask a question, what happens if I raise the wage? And his point is, if you raise the wage, you lower the profit rate so that both R over W here and here move in the same direction. And how much they cause a disturbance depends on these relative capital labor ratios again. And he ends up saying, well, I don't think even in the most exceptional circumstances that relative prices will vary much more than about 7%, even though there's a big change in distribution. Now I remind you that this is the question that Jacob Schwartz picks up when he looks at the changes in relative prices from the peak of a business cycle to the trough. And we looked at that last time, and you saw that the average variation was 7%. Again, it's not because Ricardo was a mystic. Ricardo was undoubtedly observing variations in relative prices over cycles, since that was something you could see. So he got a sense of the order of magnitude, and his example was designed to illustrate that order of magnitude. Schwartz actually goes and tests it, because now we have data on that, at least by the post-war period. And he found that when you take relative prices at the peak of a business cycle, and then whatever the next 11, 12, 15 months later, the trough of a business cycle, the variation in relative prices was only on the order of 7%. And I showed you Claudio Puti's example, which was done as a dissertation from this course, actually. And he found roughly in that same order, 7 to 8 or 9% on a much, much bigger sample of, and much time period, and many more industries also, the same thing. So this is a very strong general empirical result that we expect this term to be relatively small on average, which is what we're talking about here. Ricardo also shows that prices differ from relative labor times according to the capital labor ratio. That's clear from his numerical example. So he's the source of the idea in Marx that these differences are due to differences in organic composition of capital. And Marx cites that, as I'm going to show you in a minute. He also shows that a rise in the real wage will lead to a fall in the general rate of profit. And he does this in a very clever way. He shows it numerically, but the argument is very clever. He says, well, suppose that you had a economy in which the raw material was corn, the wage good was corn, and the output was corn. Well, clearly, value added will be corn. If wage goes up, the value add is determined by that technology and the length of the working day and all that. If wage goes up, profit will go down. that will not affect the amount of corn that you need as capital, right? Because that depends on your materials and your fixed capital. So the profit rate will go down. So intuitively, at the aggregate level, you can see that a wage rise, real wage rise, corresponds to fall in the profit rate. Again, the logic of that is very clear, and we're going to see Sraffa's incredibly beautiful and elegant extension of that, but Sraffa shows essentially in a formal way that this is the case, and it's obvious in Marx also that he understood that and built that into his argument from the beginning, which he does by saying, let's assume prices are proportional to labor time. Then it's obvious that the wages go up, the rate of surplus value goes down, the profit rate goes down. Okay? So these are familiar, so to speak. And the last point that Ricardo was concerned with, which is important, is he says, well, okay, if this term is small, then relative prices are close to relative integrated labor time. But notice also that then the changes in relative prices will be dominated by the structural element, which is direct and indirect labor time, and the distributional element will be a second order, will be disturbance term. And I showed you data on that last time, and you can see again that that is absolutely empirically true. Again, the order of variation is on the 10 or 15% magnitude. So that means that this is really the dominant term here, both in cross-sectional and time series. And I showed you that if you look over a 4-year period, 4 to 5 year period, the relative changes in relative prices are extremely close to the changes in relative labor times. The difference is on the order of 4 or 5% or 3 or 4%, so that really 96 or 97% of relative price changes over time can be explained by changes in the structure of production. Okay? Now, it should be beginning to be clear to you that this is a profoundly different way of looking at relative prices. Because this is saying that the structure of production is the dominant element, and this was the natural way in the classical tradition. Any questions here? I want to move to Marx. Okay. Ricardo, as you know, begins in first chapter of the Principles and moves to from prices proportional to labor time to prices that deviate from labor time within 50 pages. Marx being Marx, he starts the same way, but it takes him something like 1,300 pages to move from the first to the second step. And the reason is that he's interested in showing where profit comes from rather than how it's distributed. And so he's interested in distribution also, but does not want to introduce the price labor time deviations until he's extracted fully, so to speak, all the phenomena that follow from the creation of a surplus product and its assignment, so to speak, to different capitalists and rent later on also in volume 3 of Capital. So the argument is incredibly detailed, focuses on the historical rise of surplus value, on its implications, on exploitation, the length of the working day, the reserve army of labor, schemes of reproduction, two-sectoral growth and balance conditions, turnover time, all of those factors which, as he rightly pointed out, have nothing to do per se with the deviation of prices from labor time and can be seen more clearly if we leave that part for later, because all of that will simply add on to what you've already shown. This is the proper way to proceed because it then establishes that when you're making that change, you're introducing something very specific, which is the price labor time deviations and not all the other elements which are implicit already there without that. Okay? And you can see that coming from Smith, who's already shown this kind of logic, you can see why he picks it up. So Marx has forms of value, origin, significance of money, social implications of generalized exchange, social and class origins of profit, exploitation, the determination of wages, the length of the working day, the struggle over the length of the working day. All of these are inherent in the existence of profit, of the surplus product, have nothing to do per se with price value deviations. And here's Marx's comment, by the way, in Theories of Surplus Value on Smith's treatment of profit and prices. And Marx here credits Smith with discovering surplus value. Now I'm quoting. This is from Theories of Surplus Value, Chapter 3, Part 1, Chapter 3. Marx says, quote, Adam Smith quite correctly takes as his starting point the commodity and the exchange of commodities. And thus producers initially confront each other only as possessors of commodities, sellers of commodities, buyers of commodities, under conditions which lead to the equality between relative competitive prices and relative labor values. So that's Smith's root and early state. And Marx's comment there is that that's a correct starting point because it separates out commodity production from capitalist commodity production. And you can introduce capitalist commodity production without changing the law of price until you introduce unequal organic compositions of capital in a sense. Then here are further quotes from Marx and the same thing. The capitalist production begins from the moment when the conditions of labor belong to one class and another class has at disposal only labor power. Again, commenting on Smith. And this is Smith's move from having all of the income of production going to the producer to suddenly only part going because the producer has been transformed into a wage labor and the remainder goes to the capitalist. This separation of labor from the conditions of labor is the precondition of capitalist production, Marx says. But then he goes on to say, but the law of exchange in proportion to labor time contained in them is contained in the commodities, is in no way upset by the proportion which the producers divide the product, or rather their value. If part A goes to the landowner, another to the capitalist, and the third to the laborer, no matter what the share of each may be, this does not alter the fact that A itself exchanges with B according to its value. This is commenting on Smith's rude and early state. In this case, quote, value, that is the quantity of labor which workmen add to the material, falls into two parts. One pays his wages. The other forms the profit of the capitalist. Adam Smith has therefore himself refuted the idea that the circumstance under which the whole product of the labor no longer belongs to the labor, that he is obliged to share its value with the owner of capital, in itself invalidates the law that the proportion in which commodities exchange for each other is determined by the quantity of labor time materialized in them. Is that point clear? He's saying, look, Adam Smith has already shown, therefore shows that sharing out the value added between workers and capitalists, or the dispossession of workers' share and control by capital, does not need to alter the relation of price to direct and indirect labor time. This, he says, establishes that industrial profit is perfectly compatible with the sale of commodities at their labor value. Industrial profit does not, quote, originate from the sale of commodities above its value. It does not profit on alienation. Now, if you or me, a little bing goes off, profit and alienation. What is he talking about? I spent a lot of time before making the point that Marx understood perfectly well that there are two sources of profit. And here he's telling us, the reason you want to do it this way is that it excludes profit and alienation. And so you can concentrate on profit on surplus value. And he says, quote, again, indeed, on the contrary, Smith traces the profit of the capitalist precisely to the fact that he has not paid for part of the labor value, labor added to the commodity. And it is from this that his profit on the sale of commodity arises. Therefore, he has recognized the true origin of surplus value. And then he goes on to comments on Smith's division of that surplus value into rent of land, taxes, and interest. Adam Smith conceives surplus value, that is surplus labor, the excess of labor performed and realized in the commodity, over and above the paid labor, the labor which has received its equivalent in wages, as a general category. And he says this is one of the great contributions of Smith. He says that the rents, interest, profits are part of that same general pool of the excess of value over the value paid to labor. And this general category is therefore what he wants to examine first before he talks about the rules of its division. Okay? Now, Marx views Smith's commodity production, he makes that very clear in this discussion in Theory of Surplus Value, that it's an analytical device. And in fact, it's only Engels who attempts to extend it back in time. And this is a big confusion in the Marxist literature. Some people see this as an earlier stage in history. But Marx's point is that, look, there was never a stage in history where people had freely able to move from one sector of production to another, one industry to another, and kept all their income and owned their means of production. This was an analytical argument, not a historical one. Nonetheless, Engels, and even to some extent Ernest Mandel, tried to find historical echoes, so to speak. And it's possible that there are circumstances where that's the case. But it's not, in my opinion, it's not the argument that is set out in, certainly not in Marx. In fact, Marx speaks of the rude and early state as a projection onto, I quote, a paradise lost to the bourgeoisie, where people did not confront each other as capitalists, wage laborers, landowners, tenant farmers, usurers, and so on, but simply as persons who produce commodities and exchange them. And that idea of, he says this in the Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, which he wrote before he wrote Theories of Surplus Value. And this is a comment on the idea that this is a fiction, the rude and early state. It's not intended to be a reference. Yet, in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx follows the same path. And that's not because he thinks this is a historical starting point, but because he considers this to be the general analytical starting point. He starts off by saying, let us consider a situation in which private commodity producers, which he calls simple commodity production, produce a product and exchange it with each other. And if there's mobility among the producers in response to differences in their income, then they will end up with prices proportional to labor values. That's exactly Smith's argument. It always surprises me that people don't see these things like profit and alienation, the simple commodity production, so they're pretty clearly stated. The trouble is, of course, that they're stated in different parts of works that Marx didn't live to publish, and so you need to find them, so to speak. Marx says in that section, volume 1 of Capital, he says, the conversion of money into capital has to be explained on the basis of laws that regulate the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is exchange of equivalents. Again, that's a clear reference to profit and alienation, which he wants to exclude. He says himself there, we know full well that average prices do not directly coincide with the values of commodities. What is he signaling there? He's telling what Ricardo's already shown, that prices deviate from labor values when you allow for differences in capital labor ratios. But he leaves that aside for volume 3 of Capital, because he wants to first show where profit comes from. Profit of industrial capital comes from, not merchant capital, which is based on transfers. And he wants to show how it works, what phenomenon gives rise to. And the trouble, of course, is he doesn't live to do the rest. He says he's going to do this, mostly in unpublished parts anyway, and then he doesn't finish, and then Engels puts that stuff together in the way that he can, the best that he can, and it shows up in volume 3. As I said, 1,340 pages later, Marx comes to the question that takes Ricardo 30 pages to get to, which is the deviation of prices from labor time. Because this is a long journey, and because it goes through material which Marx did not live to publish himself and was put together by Engels, even careful scholars have become confused and think that he was avoiding that issue. But if you look at the contribution to critique, he says, I'm going to solve all of these problems, including this one. Prices deviate from labor values. I'm going to show you how it's done. So it's not like he didn't know. Going on to comment on Ricardo. Ricardo's investigations are concerned exclusively with the magnitude of value. He's at least aware that the full development of the law of value presupposes a society in which large-scale industrial production and free competition obtain. In other words, modern bourgeois society. David Ricardo, quoting again, David Ricardo, unlike Adam Smith, neatly sets forth the determination of values of commodities by labor time and demonstrates that this law governs even those bourgeois relations of production which apparently contradict it most decisively, meaning here the deviations are still governed by this law of value. Ricardo does this, I quote, with, quote, theoretical acumen, which gives classical political economy its final shape. And what's the central point made by Ricardo according to Marx? According to Marx, the central point made by Ricardo was, quote, the law of value dominates price movements with reductions or increases in labor time, making prices of production fall or rise. Okay, so this is, I can't think of any clearer statement of the point, and if you know the literature, you know what he's talking about. So this is like reading any literature. If you don't know what the references mean, you won't get it. But once you know it, you can see it's pretty clear. Any questions about this?
I'm a little bit confused by this. He's talking about a production under class relations where he's separating profits on alienation from profits on surplus.
Profit on surplus from profit on transfer.
Okay.
Those are two, and he calls profit on transfer profit on alienation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why does he call that alienation? Like, now you say transfer, it makes sense to me.
No, but in fact, when you read the theory of surplus value, you see Marx says, yeah, of course Stewart is right. The profit on transfer, which I will call profit and alienation. So you might ask him that question, I don't know. But he specifically used the term profit and alienation. In some sense, you can see that it's the alienation, he's speaking of merchant capital historically, and that is where developed capitalist relations impinge on less developed ones, or weaker ones, stronger ones impinge on weaker ones. We can get a commodity at a price lower than you finally sell it. So you buy cheap and sell dear. And then you alienate that commodity. In effect, you take it from people who could have gotten a higher price, and you transport it, deducting that. You still make a profit. So that difference is the profit on transfer.
But doesn't the exact same thing happen in the extraction of surplus?
No, because there, Marx's central point... No, because there, Marx's central point there is that capitalism establishes a relationship in which the price of labor power is that what it gets. He's already saying, I'm not going to deal with cheating by capitalists and all of that. I'm going to take it for granted that workers get a market wage which is established. And the point is the value of labor power is just as much that correct value as the commodity price is assumed to be sold at, also at its correct value, right? But profit and alienation is different because you know that you're buying it cheap. And you know you're selling it dear. So that's a different process. And typically, by the way, this is an interesting point, and I'm going to leave.
I feel when I'm selling my labor power that I'm selling it, like I want more, and then I'm unemployed.
Okay, but that's because you read Marx. You've been corrupted. Most people actually think that they get a fair wage. That's true. But
so markup prices, it's profit for alienation, we can say that?
no, because the idea of markup prices is an explanation of where the profit comes from. And I tried to argue in a couple lectures back that that's a fiction. You cannot have profit originating from market prices. All that market prices can do is share it out in different ways. For instance, if you start with the argument in Marx, let's say that we begin with all of the value of labor power going to workers. So there's no surplus value. I tried to show you a means of analytical examples that there's no possible way to create aggregate profit. All you can do is create profit in one sector and a negative profit in the other because the aggregate will have to be zero. That can be formally shown. If there's no surplus product, there's no aggregate profit. So markup prices cannot in any way create aggregate profit. All they can do, all the story of, and I spent quite a time on the book on this issue, all that the story of markup pricing does is make the argument that there is a mechanism through which workers get a wage below the value added, and that difference is the markup. So workers only get what capitalists choose to give them, and capitalists only choose to take what they consider their monopoly power. A very vague concept, in my opinion, terminally vague. Now notice, and neoclassical theory does the same thing, by the way. It says workers get a portion of value added. How does it say that? It says, well, look, we divide value added into two parts, the marginal product of labor times the amount of labor, which is the wage bill, plus the marginal product of capital times the amount of capital, which is profit. But that story requires that the marginal product of labor be less than, or the wage bill be less than value added. In other words, the marginal product be less than value added per worker. If that's not the case, there's no marginal product of capital left over. So by making the assumptions that these are positive numbers, less than 1, and all of that, you end up with the same story, which is that workers get a wage less than the value added, except in neoclassical theory, it's what they deserve because that's their contribution. All the theories end up saying profit comes from where Adam Smith said. It's a division of value added into one part for labor, another part for capital. But then the question becomes, how is that division accomplished? In Marx, it's through the fact that workers are divorced from the means of production. They have to accept the value added less. This is really Smith's story too. When the capital comes up, they no longer own the means of production. So they have to give a cut, so to speak. And they have to take a cut, so to speak, in that. In neoclassical theory, the big object is to show that it's justified. And post-Keynesian theory avoids this issue quite a bit because it leads to an embarrassing conclusion, which is that workers have no say in their living standard. I remember once asking at a post-Keynesian conference, asking a famous post-Keynesian economist, don't you think you should be explaining how workers' wages are determined? And the answer was, that's a good question. We should look into that in the future. Now, I find that an astonishing answer, truly astonishing. Okay?
There's one question. Can you then explain gender or race-based wage discrimination in terms of sort of buying cheap and selling dear? Or?
Indeed, you can. But the question then, yes, indeed. And let me just remind me if I get lost here in another digression, but you have to keep in mind that Marx's original project was to write 6 volumes. 6 books, of which the first book was called On Capital. On Capital was going to be 4 volumes, which include theories of surplus value. So all the material that we have that Marx published was only the first quarter of the first book. First quarter of the first book. The rest was put together by Engels, and theory of surplus value was cobbled together from his notes. But if you look at his plan was to consider the actual determination and movements of wages. Because at this level of abstraction, he's saying, I'm going to ignore all of that because I want to bring out all the phenomena that come from the fact that even if wages are equalized. But I don't want to argue that they are equalized in practice. I want to bring in those elements scientifically, one thing at a time. Right? So then his goal was to do that, and he did a tremendous amount of research on wages and wage differences and all of that, but that doesn't show up anywhere in Capital because that material is probably there. I mean, sure, it's in his notes, but it's not in the published material that we have. Same thing for business cycles. Marx abstracts from business cycles except in references to historical phenomena, but he worked a lot on that, and then he taught himself calculus, as I mentioned before, in order to think about how to formalize his movements of ups and downs, because that's a kind of thing that calculus could naturally pick up. And who knows what he did with that. I do know that he wrote a book on calculus because he got annoyed with the way the foundations of calculus, the idea of the infinitesimal, seemed to him wrong, and he set up a different foundation, not knowing at that time that mathematics was already moving away from his foundation that he was attacking and a new foundation for mathematics and calculus was being developed in Europe, in France actually. So these are what people like this do in their spare time, and he didn't have much spare time. He also worked on rent. The theory of rent is treated in volume 3 of Capital, and he treats it according to the laws of competition, the pure laws. He says, I want to derive from these assumption that everybody gets what is appropriate in the market, the laws of rent. But it doesn't mean that rent actually is identical to that. You have to show the concrete factors. And he thought the best place to study rent was Russia. I don't really know enough about Russia to know why he thought that. But anyway, he felt that this was the historical development of rent would be best illustrated through the history of Russia. So he taught himself Russian in his spare time, so he could study those documents better. Of course, he read German, he read French, he read Italian and English and so on, but he picked up Russian too so that he could study documents, historical documents. You can see also why he never finished anything, which is another story. But okay, so the question you raise is very interesting to me, because then the question is, how do you make more concrete the laws of wages? And the first step, in my opinion, is to talk about what determines the wage at a concrete level, even if you abstract from all the other factors. And that's the book that came out of this course by Howard Botwinick, called Persistent Inequality. Howard was a graduate of Wisconsin, undergraduate. Then he went and worked for, I think, a decade or more as a steel worker and organizer, and then came to graduate school, and he wrote his book on how competition produces a dispersion of wages. And his point is that when you distinguish between regulating and non-regulating capitals, you already have capitals who are in a different position vis-a-vis labor, because regulating capitals are in a stronger position than non-regulating. And he shows us you can explain the kinds of patterns you do observe in average wages from precisely this sort of understanding, which he got from the shop floor, so to speak. So there's room, and the other person who worked on this was Patrick Mason, who also came from this course, who worked on the issues of wage by race. So I think this is a topic which needs to be developed much further, but you can't do it without having this. This is the law of gravity at its abstract level. Then you need to introduce all those factors, because the other side of that, I would argue, is that these differences are not arbitrary. They're bounded. And so that's an important thing to understand. In any kind of analysis, you need to know the bounds also. I tried at one point to get people interested in doing this issue, because we have data now, using input-output tables. Here's another related issue. I told this was going to be a rant. In the level of abstraction that Smith, Ricardo, and Marx operate at that level of abstraction, they abstract from skills. Right? So we need to have a proper extension of this argument to skills, which I did in my dissertation. I didn't like it, so some 30, 40 years later, I did it again. It's sitting around in my computer someplace. I've never found a place to publish it, but you can develop the argument in this classical tradition of a theory of skill-based wages, based on the cost of skilling. Now, it's not the same as human capital. It's a different thing. It's a production cost of skilling, rather than sort of some capital embodied in your head that you're walking around with. And that implies a theory of wage differentials. In order to do this, what you need to do is take input-output tables and apply skill indexes to that. Now, we have wage indexes, so you're basically looking to see what's the relation between wage indexes and skill indexes. And that people have been doing that, but they've been doing it from a neoclassical framework. Becker dominates everything, and so even people working in the classical tradition are working in that at a concrete level. And there's no reason to do that. In my opinion, you can come up with a different understanding, and perhaps it's not better. But as a former student of Gary Becker, I don't think it could be any worse, because that data doesn't work. I mean, that analysis does not work very well at an empirical level at all. Okay, the rant is over. Let me get back to, I don't want to run out of time here. I want to now move to the transformation problem, because I'm building up to this promised land of eigenvalue distribution, so I don't want to get lost. Here's an example taken from Paul Sweezy, the famous illustration of the transformation problem. And just to tell you what it is, these are industries, means of production, means of subsistence, and capitalist consumption. 3 industries. This is the constant capital, which is the labor value of the raw materials, in this case. Variable capital is the labor value of the wages. And surplus value is the cost price is the sum of the two. So in the first sector, the labor value of materials and wages is 630. Everybody can see that? Second, third, and so on, and you can add these numbers up. And I've assumed that these, I'm talking here in money terms, because I wanted to emphasize that the price is proportional to labor values does not imply equality. Prices are in units of pounds or dollars, and labor values units of hours. So then the total value, labor value is constant capital, variable capital, surplus value. The total value is the sum of the three. So in the first sector is 375, and the profit rate is 19% here because the organic compositions are unequal. So if prices are proportional to labor values, the different sectors will have different profit rates. Everybody see that? I mean, you can work through the numbers here, but you can see that surplus value is proportional to labor time. In terms of value relation, labor value relationships, constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, and by definition, surplus value is proportional to labor time. It's a surplus labor. So it's proportional to labor time. So the division S over V is the same in every sector, right? That implies that if your profit's proportional to these, then your profit is going to be proportional to labor, not to total capital. And therefore, profit rates will be unequal. If the relationship of C to V is different, then S over C plus V is going to have a different ratio than S over V. Okay, let me do that again. Labor value is C plus V. This is unfortunately two V's, so I have to call this something else. Plus S, where S is proportional, and sigma here is the ratio of S over V. So every sector has a profit proportional to its wages. But the rate of profit is S over C plus V, and that is going to be sigma VI over CI plus VI, which is sigma over CI over VI plus 1. And you can see that the rates of profit will not be equal because the ratios of constant to variable capital are different, if they are different. If they're different. So you can show conversely, if they're the same, then prices proportional to labor time will give you equal profit rates, right? Which is Smith's point and Ricardo's point. All right. So here, this is the example from Sweezy. So you have the total profit is proportional to this. So total price is 750, cost price is 630. The total profit is 120, and the profit rates are here. And they are clearly unequal. Now, then the question is, how does Marx handle this? And Marx says, well, okay, they're unequal. So the first thing that has to happen is that prices have to move away from proportionality to labor time. So here are the prices in the beginning: 750, 600, 400. But the first sector has a profit rate below the average, so its price must go up. Second sector has a profit rate which is, I don't even remember where the average is here. I think it doesn't show on the screen, so let me see if I can get it in here. Yeah. The average profit rate isn't calculated here, but anyway, it's somewhere around here. So this sector's price will go down a little bit. This is a little bit higher than the average, and this is much higher. So the third sector's price has to go down a lot. Right? So that's intuitively, if prices of one sort give you unequal profit rates, then the prices have to change if they're going to give you equal profit rates. Right? This is an analytical argument. So Marx says, okay, then the first sector's price goes from 750 to 816.67. That gives you, the average profit rate is 29.63, so that has to go up this amount to give you 29. The second has to go down from 600 to 570 to give you 29.63, and the third has to go from 400 to 362 to give you this profit rate, right? And that's a straightforward statement that says that profit rates have to deviate from labor values in order to equalize, prices have to deviate from labor values in order to equalize profit rates. And this point is already obvious from Ricardo. It's built into Ricardo's numerical example. Okay? Any questions about this? Because this is a very key step. This is the famous transformation procedure. And I'm going to come now to the transformation problem. Okay? I have a strong sense of puzzlement in the room. It's like a ghost, you know. It's like one of those movies, the ghost in the. Okay, so if you do this, then Marx comments on this by saying that. I'm sorry. Let me remind you that this procedure that we have here, this is not Marx's numbers, but the procedure is Marxist in Volume 3 Capital, is something that Marx never wrote for publication. These comes from his notes, and the fragments of his notes that Engels chose to put into volume 3 of Capital. So we don't know what else is there. But Engels does put the following other fragment. First point is that this process of the transformation was already worked out by Marx before the publication of volume 1. Volumes 2 and 3 were written in draft form, which is where Engels gets all this stuff, before volume 1 was published. And that means that obviously when Marx is working in volume 1 on the assumption that prices are proportional to labor time, he is already anticipating what he's worked out in volumes 2 and 3, and this is from the volume 3 part, the draft. In fact, these were written in 1863 to 1867, and volume 1 was published in 1867, so these were written before. Now, the second point is Marx says, okay, well, so what have I done here? I've changed prices. The prices have gone from 750, this one's gone up, this one's gone down, this one's gone down. Then he says, but you must take into account the fact that if I've changed the prices of these commodities as goods being sold, then the prices as raw materials and of wage goods must also change. In other words, any changes of output prices must have some implication for the input prices. And here's a quote from Marx, which comes right after this discussion here. The foregoing statements have at any rate modified the original assumption concerning the determination of the cost prices. This is what Marx calls cost prices, the sum of materials costs and wage costs, 630 here. We had originally assumed that the cost price of a commodity equals the value of the commodity consumed in its production. But for the buyer, the price of production of a specific commodity is its cost price, and thus must pass this cost prices into the prices of other commodities. Since the price of production here may differ from price proportional to labor value, it follows that the cost price here must differ from the value of a commodity here. It cannot any longer be the same number. It is necessary to remember this modified significance of the cost price and to bear in mind that there is always possibility of error if the cost price of a commodity in any particular sphere is identified with the value of the means of production consumed by it. Our present analysis does not necessitate a closer examination of this point. Now, this is in Marx's unpublished notes, which are published in volume 3 of Capital. So we have really literally no idea what other material Marx would have added had he written it himself. But we know that he's established anyway that you can't have price changes on one side without taking into account on the other side. Now, a second point I want to make here, is this point clear? And I'm leading obviously to Sraffa, people who know Sraffa, but also to Bortkiewicz, because the whole debate on the transformation problem came about saying, well, if we feed these prices back, or first they said there's no relationship between this and a correct set of prices. Correct set prices being simultaneously calculating the prices of inputs and outputs so they reflect the same profit rate. So the first thing I wanted to show, I want to make 2 points. First of all, here, notice that Marx's transformation.
So sorry, can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
This is where you're at right now.
Yeah.
What is the reason for, say, like I'm kind of maybe going backwards, but like time is passing. It's always a new cycle. What is this? Like why do the production? I think you said takes time. Like it's a new moment, a new price. So.
Well, we're asking here what's the analytical character of prices of production. And if you have an analytical question of that sort, then obviously the prices as outputs must reflect the same prices as inputs. Otherwise, you're speaking about the same good priced in two different prices, which you can do. But the first simpler question is what happens if it's priced in the same way as inputs and outputs? Even if time is repeating, say in simple reproduction or any kind of process where the conditions of production are repeating, then the input and output prices, other things being equal, are the same. That's an analytical question. What's the shape of these prices? The same thing could be said of labor values too, by the way. The values of inputs going in are not necessarily the values of the inputs coming out. But of course you want to first ask, under the condition of assuming they are the same, what properties hold before you want to introduce changes. That's obviously the proper way to proceed, one thing at a time. So question, is that okay?
I need to think about it.
Okay, I mean in any kind of thing you want to separate out the influence of the other factors, right? And one way to do that is to say this question. I would make a somewhat different argument that actually prices are changing. You have to allow for the capital gains and losses, and that affects the story, but I don't want to get into that now. The point is that for this purposes, you want to take into account the analytical move from one set of prices to another. And to do that, you want to have the same principle on both sides, which is the prices of inputs and prices of outputs are the same. That is true of labor values here, so it should also be true of prices of production. Okay. One point I want to make here is that Marx's prices are linear. As I said here, if you If you see what the price that Marx has derived, it's C plus V, or money equivalent of C plus V, plus the profit rate, which is 29, times C plus V. So in this case, the money equivalent of C plus V, which is in the money circuit here, is 225 plus 90. So the price of the first sector is 225 plus 90 plus 29.63 times 225 plus 90 here. I'm sorry, I didn't say that right. 450 and 180, that's the money price, money equivalent of labor time. Here, that's the cost price, 630. So the price here is 630 plus 29.63 times 630, and that's what gives you 816. Okay? And the same thing for every other sector. Cost price plus a profit rate on that will give you the... Notice that this is, if you don't allow for feedback effects, this is a linear price. And at the first level of approximation, this price is linear. So now two questions arose immediately. First of all, if you feed back, what's the relationship between the final price and this, what might be thought of as the initial price? In 1973, which is an amazingly long time ago, when I came here after I finished my PhD at Columbia, I wrote a paper in which I showed that you can take this price and you can feed it back to the inputs, and that means the profit rates will now be unequal because the inputs have changed, but you haven't changed the output price, so you have to change the output price again and feed it back again. And if you have had any engineering exposure, you recognize that this is an iterative solution to a simultaneous equation system in which the same prices are applied inputs and outputs, and I showed that it always will converge on the standard assumptions of what the shape of an input-output matrix is, the properties of input-output matrix. And what determines that turns out to be the eigenvalues of the matrix, which is the point. So that paper was published in 1977. And what I was able to prove is you can think of Marx's transformation as the first step. And as he himself says, you want to feed it back. So feed it back. That produces a new set of costs. Therefore, the prices have to be adjusted to give you equal profit rates again and again, again. But the difference converges, and at some point, you've got the right answer. Which means that it was entirely within the capabilities of someone like Marx to see that. In fact, he's already signaled that he understands that you have to do that, but he doesn't consider that to be particularly important right now. Okay? If you do this, however, profit is no longer proportional to, is no longer what it was before. Profit before was, is 1750, and if you keep feeding these prices back, the profit, if you keep the sum of prices the same, which is 750, the sum of profits changes, so that it no longer is 400, it becomes some number slightly different. And so then the question arises, which is a different question, how can it be that mere changes in relative prices, keeping the total value of the product in money terms constant, or money value of the product constant, how can profit appear or disappear? And I tried to show you in some lectures back that this is exactly the question of transfers. Because what's happening here? What you're doing is having prices differ from those which correspond to labor values. So you are bringing about a transfer. As soon as this price is price proportional to labor value. As soon as this goes up, that means the first sector is getting some profit above that coming from its own surplus value. The other two go down, so they're losing some surplus value to someone else. It seems on the surface that the sum of these losses and gains must be zero. That's pretty clear. But it doesn't follow that the sum of gains and losses within the circuit of capital is zero. And that's why I spent all that time showing you that transfers between the circuit of capital and the circuit of revenue can create or eliminate profit. So that when you add up the accounting schema, you can see that the sums are exactly zero, but there are two players, circuit of capital and circuit of revenue. Think of them as two islands. If there are two islands, the circuit of capital is here and the circuit of revenue is here, the balance of payments across both islands has to be zero. But it doesn't follow that the balance of payment of this island has to be zero, because it can be positive and that one can be negative, or vice versa. And what I show in the book and what I showed earlier in some articles was that you can explain this difference. So now we are boiled down to one thing only. The mystery of the appearance or disappearance of profits is dissolved, and what we're concerned with is the properties of the price itself, which is that what does it look like when you allow for all of these feedback effects? How is the price going to look as a function of the rate of profit? In Marx's case, it's linear. But the point is that if you fully transform, that is, you allow inputs and outputs to have the same prices, then you will get, even keeping the sum of the commodities money value the same, you'll get a profit which is 350, which is different than the original profit of 400, and that's exactly what you can explain by transfers. But we might also ask, well, what happens if you change the wage rate? What happens to these correct prices, these Straub-Bartkiewicz prices? And that's a question I want to turn to next, because that's Sraffa's question. Sraffa's concerned with the shape of the price curve as you change wages. Marx is concerned with the transfer between surplus value from one sector to another and in and out of the circuits of capital and revenue by implication. Okay? What I did not realize when I did my original iterative transformation, which was published, as I said, in 1977 in an article called Marxist Theory of Value and the Transformation Problem, it's on my homepage, is that I showed that it depends on the eigenvalues, but I didn't see that if the subdominant eigenvalues was 0, which seemed like a pretty strict and improbable condition, but in any case I didn't see it. If they were 0, then it only takes one iteration. And if it only takes one iteration, Marx's transformation is effectively correct. And that understanding came about in another part of the world, in Hungary, from the work of András Bródy. András Bródy was interested in a different problem coming from the planning side, which is how fast does a vector of initial output proportions converge to the balanced growth path that you want. You can see that's very similar. Here you have a balanced profit rate path, and there he's interested in equal rates of growth rather than equal profit rates. And he concluded that it depends on the distribution of eigenvalues, and it was proved formally, as I'm going to come back to in a minute. And then it turns out that if the eigenvalues have some special property, which he, in effect, implicitly hypothesized, it takes only one iteration. But that means that then Bródy's problem's one iteration is also Marx's problem, one iteration, which would be an astonishing result because it implies that Marx's transformation is correct, strictly speaking. Now, it's a lovely result. I'd love it to be true, but I think it's not true. And I'm going to try and argue why I think it's not true. And then we're going to do the empirical results. It would be great because then I could write a paper called Marx's Last Theorem, but unfortunately, I think it's not true. So to do this, I need to take a digression through Sraffa. I mean, there's no way you can talk about this without speaking about Sraffa. And Sraffa says that he's interested in taking up a question, which is the question of, the classical question of the movements of prices as you change the wage rate. In other words, the sensitivity and path of prices as you change distribution. Remember I said that Ricardo says that this factor will be small. Sraffa wants to make the argument that this is an issue to be investigated and that it has some powerful implications, and that Sraffa's book is, as I've said many times, a thing of great beauty and complexity. He wants to analyze properties of an economic system, I quote, as do not depend on changes in the scale of production or the proportion of factors. He's interested in looking only at what he calls natural prices or prices of production. So he's asking this question, but he's asking something different, which is if I change the value of labor power, if I change this wage up or down, that's going to change profits up or down. What effect is that going to have on price? And that's Ricardo's question. You can recognize that right away from first chapter in Ricardo. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through a lot of things I meant to talk about Sraffa because I want to get to the key point before I run out of time. So Sraffa's main concern will be the feedback effect, what I've been calling the feedback effect. If I change prices, Sraffa says, then I've changed costs. If I change costs, then the prices are no longer valid if they had equal profit rates, so that they must be simultaneously valid. They must reflect the profit rate, equal profit rates when applied both as inputs and outputs. And Sraffa is not so much interested in solving this analytically, though he does do that. He's interested in the question of their path, which is a question, which is where all the beauty of the argument comes about. So let me go down to a simple Sraffa system. There's nothing terribly mysterious about the algebra here, but Sraffa's notation is somewhat different. Let all the L's be labor time per unit output in each sector. So this is a labor time, L1 is a labor time per unit output in sector 1, sector 2, sector 3. All the prices are the prices of goods. P1 is the price of the first good, P2 is the price of the second good, P3 is the price of the third good. The wage rate is uniform because he's only talking about prices of production. That's W. And the profit rate is uniform. He's only talking about equal profit rates. And capital is by definition the same thing as inputs because he's assuming circulating capital. So the stock and flow with one period of turnover, so the stock and flow are equal. This is just to make it, bring out the pure logic of the argument without the details. And the details make it more complicated, but this is pretty complicated, as you will see. Now, it's obvious here that the prices as inputs are the same as prices as outputs. So this is the fully transformed system, right? And this price system, Sraffa says, now look, I have a 3 by 3 system, so I'm going to have 3 equations, but I have 5 variables because I have wages, I have 3 prices, P1, P2, P3, and I have a profit rate. So I have a system with 3 equations and 5 variables. The first thing you can do is to note that you can pick one of the commodities as a numeraire. So you can go back and say, okay, I've got that, but I can choose P1 or P2 or P3 as a numeraire. Now mathematically, choosing a numeraire is equivalent to adding one more equation saying P, K, whichever it is equal to 1. You could do that. But Sraffa asks a different question. He says, well, if I choose that, here's my difficulty. Then every price will be a ratio of price commodity 1 relative to the kth price. And so when I observe their movements, I'm going to have this problem. Is it caused by the commodity I'm looking at, or is it caused by my numeraire? Everybody see that? If you have two things that can move complicated, the ratio is going to be even more messy. And I won't know whether it's coming from the price, the commodity I'm looking at, the price of corn, or is it coming from my numeraire, which happens to be steel. And so Sraffa asks a really amazing, beautiful question. He said, is there any commodity that I can say needs to change its price when I change the wage rate? Because what happens when I change the wage rate? I raise the wage rate, the profit rate goes down. He's going to show you that. So then some prices will rise depending on whether the wage rate has a bigger effect. The rise in the wage rate has a bigger effect than the fall, so the price will go up. In other industries, the opposite. You can see it's clearly going to depend on capital labor ratios. And he says, well, can I imagine an industry or a commodity which doesn't? And the answer is no. Any individual commodity, no. But I can take a mixture of these, and he proves this formally. I can create an average commodity whose price has no reason to change because its structure is such that whatever change in the wage rate occurs, its profit will move in just the right amount to give it the correct rate of profit, a different rate of profit, but I'm sorry, keep the price the same. And he shows you how to define that. He calls that the standard commodity. And it has to have some special properties which we can recognize mathematically easily, but it's a beautiful operation. And then he shows that that commodity, if you use it as the numeraire, means that you are defining all prices relative to the standard commodity price. And if you do that, then it follows that the wage expressed in that, and this is the beauty of it, the wage expressed in terms of this special commodity will have a linear relation to profit. So that if this wage now represents the money wage relative to the price of the standard commodity, then it can be interpreted as the wage share in a standard system. It'll follow the rule 1 minus small r over big R. Small r is the profit rate. Big R is the maximum profit rate. So the wage will go from where the profit rate is 0, the wage will be 1, the wage share will be 1. All net national product goes to workers. Conversely, when the wage share is 0, the profit rate will be equal to the maximum profit rate. So he shows you we have a linear relationship between the wage share in the standard system and the profit rate. Why is that handy? He makes a point that he goes to a complicated derivation of the commodity that satisfies these rules. He shows you that that commodity is unique. He shows you that that commodity implies this relationship. And then he says, but since this relationship is unique, I can simply add it to my original system, and I'm de facto using the commodity without having to find it. I'm de facto using the standard commodity as a numeraire. So if I go back to my original system without knowing what the standard commodity is, how to calculate it, doing all those complicated things, I just add to this equation system, I just add the further requirement that the wage be equal to 1 minus small r over big R. I add that equation. So here I have this system, which unfortunately here reads as 0, 0 because I cannot get the translations right into these things. But anyway, this equation system is here. Plus, I add another equation. So this is an n equations. And so now I have here plus 1 equation. So I have n plus 1 equations. I have n plus 2 variables. But now implicitly I'm using the standard commodity as a numeraire, which means that any price when I look at it, the movement of that price relative to the standard commodity, all its complexity comes from it. Because the standard commodity has been defined in such a way that it cannot contribute it doesn't move. It's a perfect numeraire for this particular issue, which is the distribution of changes. So with this in mind, adding this equation means that I have de facto expressed all prices in terms of the standard commodity. And now notice what that implies if we go back to Adam Smith's vertical integration. If I go back to Adam Smith's vertical integration, and now the price is a function of the rate of profit, and I can write it as vertically integrated unit labor costs plus vertically integrated profits, which is the wage rate times vertically integrated labor time, plus a profit rate times a vertically integrated capital output ratio. I'm just an identity. I'm just writing it out that way. So, but if wages are equal and profit rates are equal, these W and R are the same across sectors. And that means that I can substitute for the W 1 minus small r over r. And by doing that, I've made the numeraire equal to be this beautiful unchanging numeraire. And the price of any commodity relative to its labor value, that's the key finding from Sraffa, is equal to the wage rate divided by, I'm just taking wage rate here, dividing through by V, so that goes over there. Then I have P minus KR. Let me do that. Maybe I should do that here. I'm going a little bit too fast here, so let me do it here. So I can write this always. This is supposed to be a kappa. I'm not very good with Greek letters. That's the identity, the Smithian identity. Any price is the sum of its unit labor costs plus its unit profits per unit. Vertically integrated unit labor costs, vertically integrated profit. Now, I can divide through and sorry, I lost where I was. Yeah. What do I want to do? Hang on a second. I need to step back a bit. Yeah. I can substitute for this W, 1 minus R over R. So I have P of R I is now 1 minus R over R VI plus R kappa of I. I'm putting the R subs here to indicate these are functions of R. And I can, again, write this as Pi times kappa over Pi. So all I've done is put a Pi on both sides. I can factor out that Pi, and what I get is 1 minus R, and divide through by the Vi, 1 minus R over R, over 1 minus R over this ratio, which I'm going to call 1 over VR, I think. Is that right? Pi. Yes, KR. Pi over KR. This is 1 over VR. And you can check that. The algebra is pretty straightforward, even if I may not get it right. Now, this is seems like a simple relationship, but it isn't really. But it is beautiful nonetheless. The ratio of a standard price, a price expressed in terms of the standard commodity, so it doesn't have any fluctuations coming from the numeraire, relative to labor value is dependent on 1 minus small r over big R, over 1 minus small r over big R times an additional term, and this term here turns out to be the ratio of the output output capital ratio in the standard system, that system that never changes its price, relative to the actual system. And that shows us that all of the variation really comes about from the difference here between the standard system's output capital, vertically integrated output capital ratio, and the actual system's vertically integrated output capital ratio. Now, Sraffa then says, this seems simple, but keep in mind that that last number here is complicated because it's a number that varies with the profit rate. And I'm going to skip a lot of detail here, but just make central point. The number varies with the profit rate, and it can vary in ways that make the price move up and down. So it's not true that as you increase the profit rate from 0 to the maximum, the price would follow a linear path, as in Marx. It could follow wiggles, it could change direction, it could go any way. And the intuition for this is the following. if I go back to the original system here, and I say, let me raise the wage, which is now expressed in terms of the standard commodity, and lower the profit rate. Then some sectors' prices may go up and other sectors' prices may go down. We saw that in the transformation problem. This is a different version of that same problem. But Sraffa says, okay, suppose this goes up and these two go down. We don't know the effect on the costs, but the costs could go in such a way that makes it necessary in the next round for the price to go in the other direction. So the price here went up, but then when you factor in all the price changes onto the cost may go down so much that the next round the price may go down. So as you keep moving the profit rate, the price may initially move away from labor value in one direction, but then it may wiggle, or it may even come down and cross over. So in principle, you get a very complicated movement of prices. And that implies, again, that the linearity implicit in almost every theory of price, which is that prices somehow reflect some differences in technology or something, is not going to be true. You could have, this is the maximum profit rate, this is 0, this is the profit rate on the axis here, and this is the price of the ith commodity. It starts from at a 0 profit rate, it's equal to its labor value. You can see that from the formula. The profit rate is 0, all the other terms drop out and it becomes 1. Just to go back here, you can see here, if the profit rate is 0, this term R over R becomes 0, so this is just 1. Here it's also 0, so it's just 1, so price is equal to labor value. P over V is equal to 1, right? So if I plot that here, it's going to start at labor value. So this is V sub I, and this is generally P R sub I. And now, let's say in Marx, let's say that this goes, implicitly goes up to here. That's a linear relationship. Sraffa's point is, it may start here, but then it could come down. It could wiggle, it could maybe even change direction. We don't know. In general, anything is possible. So he says, in general, we'd expect that there'd be a series of complicated movements. By implication, any kind of idea that prices deviate from some base direction is false. Now he's using this to attack the idea of the capital, measure of capital in neoclassical production function theory. But it also implicitly attacks or overthrows the idea, any idea that prices can have a character. Now he doesn't emphasize this, he's concerned more with the wiggles, but in principle it could go any which way. And that raises, of course, an interesting question. If this is true, and it is true in the sense that you can make numerical examples for which it is true, most of the Sraffians have spent a great deal of time doing that, then you have basically said you can't say anything about prices. You can only say that they are complicated. But you can't say they go up or down, they could go up and down, it depends on the interactions of all sorts. And so you'd expect to see tremendous wiggles and directions. But when you look at the data, again, here's the circulating capital model in the United States. That is a model in which I abstract from fixed capital. And every sector's price is calculated, all the results are the same in every year, so I'm only showing you one. You have in every table here, you have 10 or 11 prices, and they move from where the price value ratio is equal to 1. It's always equal to 1 at 0, so you can plot them neatly this way. And you can see that they move away. As the profit rate gets bigger, you can see they move away. You can see here they move away. You see here, now some here that are not very different, you'll see this moves away, but it sort of flattens out here. And there'll even be ones that are very close to 1 that move away and then come and change direction, like this one here. So you do get Sraffa's possibilities. But what you see actually is that almost all of them are monotonic in their movements, which is contrary to Sraffa's general hypothesis. And they are curvilinear. They're not linear, but most of them have a pretty linear shape. You see these here, here and here and here. Some of them, you get some curvature. Usually, if they're close to 1, you get some curvature. But otherwise, by and large, you get something pretty close to linear. And certainly for a first approximation, it can be treated linear. But now, see what happens when you include fixed capital into the story.
These are different sectors?
These are all different sectors of a US input-output table. I think there are 75 sectors or 73 sectors. When you include fixed capital, suddenly these things all become very linear. Damn, wrong one. This is the wrong graph. Well, never mind. it's the wrong, I copied the wrong graph. This is the graph of the output capital ratios, that famous V sub R, which is linear. And the corresponding price graph is also linear. But so imagine that this is the price graph because it looks just like this, except you can see it goes out the other way. It goes from 1. And you'll find that they're all linear. Almost all linear. There are very, very few wiggles, and they're all, when they're very close to 1, then the feedback effect can kind of pull you over. But if the capital labor ratios are different than 1, different from the standard one, you move away. So this contradicts Sraffa's whole argument. I don't know if I can make it, but I'm going to try. And the linearity of these prices implies that the relation between wages and profits is essentially linear, or close to linear. In fact, I'm skipping this, but in the book I derive wage profit curves for the US economy in different years, and you'll see that they are slightly curved when you include fixed capital, very slightly curved, and essentially close to linear, near linear. And that raises a theoretical question of why. Now here's an example of the implication of that. Suppose I have two, this is from Paul Samuelson's attempt to show that production functions, the pseudo production function is valid. Suppose you have two linear wage profit curves. A wage profit curve is a relationship between the wage rate, productivity, profit rate, and capital per unit labor. If this is a linear relationship, then you can plot these curves as linear ones, and the one here's the productivity at the vertical axis here, and the maximum profit rate is at the horizontal axis. And if one curve has a higher productivity and a lower capital output capital ratio, then the curves will intersect, or you can create the frontier anyway, which is among these intersections. And you'll find, let's say, consider a situation where you're looking at these two curves which do intersect so that you can create a frontier from their intersections. Then it'll be true that at the point of intersection, and this is the key point, the intersection is a point where they have the same profit rate and the same wage rate. By definition, that's the definition of intersection. But then that means you're comparing two of them where the delta W and the delta Y, delta W is 0 because they have the same wage rate, and the delta R is 0, which implies that the delta K be proportional, the delta Y be proportional to delta K. In other words, if you define them at the intersection where they have a common wage rate and a common rate of profit, then the difference between the delta Y will be equal to the common profit rate times delta K, so delta Y over delta K is R. What is this delta Y over delta K? It's the change in value added per worker over the change in capital per worker, or in other words, the change in value added per change in capital. And that is apparently a marginal product of capital. So if you have these linear curves, the intersection, at the intersection point, the incremental product of capital will be equal to the profit rate. And that looks like a marginal product of capital. And it looks like the neoclassical production function story, because the same thing can be shown for the wage rate. So here you have what looks like a pseudo production function. But the point here, of course, is that this is not a physical product of capital. This relationship is a profit relationship in which the output, delta Y of R, that means the change in real output per worker, is a function of R, and the change in capital, real capital per worker, is a function of R. And the fact that this looks like a marginal product does not imply that there's a causal relationship from the marginal product to the profit rate. This is true just because of the linearity. And it would be equally true if you had any theory of the wage which gave you a profit rate. Or for that matter, any theory of the profit which gave you a wage rate, because the profit and wage relation is a linear one in this standard commodity. So give me a wage rate, let's say determined by social struggle, then I have a profit rate, and then I will have this if price curves are linear and wage profit curves are linear. So the fact that you have this relationship does not establish anything about the causation. And if you think about it, that's right. The assumption in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx is that prices are, at first approximation, proportional to labor values. Hence, these curves will be linear because they come from linear prices. So if they're linear, then you will have this pseudo marginal product equal to the profit rate, but nowhere does this imply that Marx or Smith or Ricardo is arguing that the marginal product of capital causes the profit rate. If anything, this is a pseudo-marginal product because it depends on prices. It's not capital or output, it's the money value of capital and the money value of output. So the pseudo marginal product equal to the profit rate or the wage rate on the other side is an indication of the linearity of the process, but not the causal structure at all. Nor does it imply that somehow the neoclassical argument of a full employment of labor because wages are flexible. In fact, the earliest argument of real wage flexibility and its relation to employment comes from volume 1 of Capital, chapter 25, which is called the theory of the reserve army of labor. And Marx specifically argues that if the unemployment rate is too big, wages will be driven down. This will make profits higher, in which case some of that labor will be picked up, but it doesn't follow that it'll end up at full employment. According to his argument, which is formalized in Goodwin and can be formalized in other ways, you end up with a normal rate of unemployment through competition, through the perfection of competition, so to speak, is that it produces a persistent unemployment of labor. So these pseudo relationships do not reinstate marginal productivity theory. They explain the apparent empirical fit because they come from an accounting identity and possible underlying linearity. Okay? Any questions about this? So I'm going to skip over all summarizing what I've said so far, except to say that here comes the punchline. If Brody is right, then you can get this kind of relationship, and you get linearity, because as a matrix gets bigger, its eigenvalues get smaller, and in the end they have a limiting effect possibility on the shape. But the only problem is when you look more carefully, the hypothesis that Brody needs and that others, Sheffield and Bedard and Schottman and all are focused on, is the idea that as a matrix gets bigger, that is, as you zoom in on the detail of an economy and look in more and more detail, you do a kind of Google Earth, you step back, you've got a 3 by 3 matrix. But as you zoom in through the clouds and you look at all the little factories and the people working and you come in, you get a bigger and bigger matrix, right? You're getting more detail. Their argument depends on the fact that as you get more detailed, the matrix becomes more like a random matrix, a big random matrix. And a random matrix, as it becomes infinitely large, as it approaches infinity, has this property that its eigenvalues, subdominant eigenvalues, go towards 0. It can be shown and has been proven, and it's a beautiful proof. The trouble is that I don't find it at all plausible that if I zoom in, I do Google Earth and zoom in, and I'm looking here at a bakery and I'm looking here at a steel mill, I'm going to see roughly the same distribution of coefficients, which is what in a random matrix implies, that every column is roughly a draw from the same population. So it's going to look similar. I'm going to see more and more differences. So then how do we explain this linearity? If things become more different, you think the curves will become more complicated, like in Straffa. But there's another aspect which is important. As you zoom in, you'll see that there are more and more zeros. A bakery doesn't use molten steel. It doesn't use coal. It doesn't need the huge amounts of inputs necessary to make steel. Steel, on the other hand, doesn't use flour and doesn't use dough and so on. And so the elements with flour and dough will here all be zeros, and the elements for molten steel here will be zeros. And as I look in more detail, I'm going to see more and more zeros, which is what you see. So here's the paradox, and I don't have an answer to it. If you zoom in, you're going to expect to see the elements which are positive to be more different. Here you have steel and coal and iron and molten things coming out of the foundry, and here you have dough and flour and wax paper and so on. And they're not going to have the same coefficients. But then if I look, I'll see that as the matrix gets bigger, I'll have more and more zeros. So even though they become dissimilar in their concrete detail, they become more similar in the fact that they have more and more zeros. That's my intuition, which has got a 50-50 record historically, so it could be entirely wrong. But what I discovered is that when I move from circulating capital to fixed capital, I immediately get more zeros because goods which are fixed capital do not enter into raw materials. So if I look at my matrix and I parse those out, I'll see that my input-output matrix has zeros for consumption goods because in Straffa they don't enter into the basic, has zeros for equipment, two sets of zeros, many, 38 out of 53 or something like that. And that matrix, that's in the presence of those zeros that makes the basic good thing, makes the wage profit curves and the price curves so linear. And that brings me to the last point. Apologize for running over. If I'm trying to represent the economy in a 3-sector model, what's the appropriate way? What everybody does is make up some numbers. I'll put a coefficient here, I'll put a constant there, and I'll make it complicated. But it seems to me that if you're going to represent the actual relation, then you have to make a 3-sector model that has the following structure. For input-output matrix. Materials, so that row is filled. Consumption goods, that row is 0. Capital goods, that row is 0. So your A matrix will have one column, one row which is filled, and 2 0 rows. Now you can immediately show that that kind of matrix will give you linear price curves. And so the representative 3x3 model will have that kind of thing, and that is actually what Marx ends up arguing for in schemes of reproduction. He doesn't show it numerically, but he says when we include capital goods, we have to deal with that. So interestingly enough, there is a reflection of this representative standard model already in the schemes of reproduction. And that tells us that you are not free to make up any numbers because you are making up the assumption about the structure of the economy. And there is a structure. By making up the numbers, you're ignoring the structure. It'd be like my going onto Mars and saying, here I'm on Mars, let's assume the gravity is the same as in Jupiter. People say, wait a minute, there's a relationship between the mass of Mars and the gravity on Mars. You can't just make up that number. And the same way you cannot just make up the structure. Okay, so this is a very small window into a complicated subject. And next time I'm going to move on to the next subject, which I believe is the theory of finance, if I'm keeping track of where I am here. So try to do the reading, because that subject is even more mysterious than eigenvalues and prices, as I'm going to try and show you.
Yes, I know. It's pretty unclear on the one hand. On the other hand, it does raise certain questions about, how. Yes, sorry. This one does have a lot of math, and it goes in several different directions, including certain ways in which you think about matrix algebra, or the way you think about how what Sraffa implies is that there's a certain amount of regularity, whereas Shaikh is telling us, okay, well, you can use that model, but you really sort of need to think about other matters that are render this inconsistent. Anyway, that being said, I'm gonna. We won't go to 11 because lecture 11 is about, financialization, and we won't get there for a while. We have to cover some other things before we get there. But it's not irrelevant. It's just simply there's a lot of material to cover. We're blundering through. Remember, Sheikh's text is 1,024 pages, so there's a lot going on. And we'll get there. Anyway, I'm going to stop the live stream. Let me thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Ann.
And then I'll stop the share. Let me